Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Neutrik presentation here on Audio Network Solutions. Specifically today we're going to be talking about a couple of our Dante devices along with a PoE injector, which can be used with those devices and all sorts of other network devices, and some handy accessories as well. So let's begin. My name is Fred Morgenstern. I'm the product director here at Neutrik USA. I've been with the company for about 10 years. I've probably spoken with you if you've had a deep technical question about Neutrik products. If not, there's a high possibility that we'll speak in the future. So let's talk about Neutrik. You know Neutrik for over 45 years of experience, specifically in the connector market, where we have set a tremendous number of standards: the XLR combo, Speak-On, PowerCon, EtherCon, OpticalCon, the D-size shape. Neutrik has been the standard setter in the industry for connectors. The whole audio-video industry would look extremely different had Neutrik not entered the market and been the dominant presence that we are in the market. We are also a solutions manufacturer, and this sometimes gets forgotten because we are so dominant in connectors, but digital networks like Dante are on the rise. We already have a tremendous number of different adapters for different products, which we'll take a look at here in the next coming slide. So again, you know us, I'm sure, for our connectors. We set the standards in all these different sorts of ways. We are the most trusted connector brand in professional audio video. We work hard to maintain that status and to be sure that we're serving your needs both now and for the future as well. We also sell a lot of different adapters. This is a screenshot from our webpage, and you can see 74 different search results for adapters. And these are everything that go from, let's say, 3-pin to 5-pin XLRs, from XLR to 1/4 inch, from BNC to RCA, etc. We've been in this passive adapter space for a long time, and we make a lot of helpful products in this space. We also make a lot of miscellaneous products. We make transformers, goosenecks. We have really a terrific portfolio of gooseneck products, specialized rack panels, different patch panels, including what may be the most popular of the prosumer patch panels on the market, which is the NYS-SPP-L1. Very good selling, very long-term popular product that we have. And we make active devices. If you're in the broadcast space, you may know about Opticam Switch, which is used to switch the fiber signals plus the power from up to 8 cameras to up to 4 CCUs. These devices are stackable. They can be put under Ethernet control. Very powerful devices for large broadcast studios. Power monitoring devices for fiber optics. We have always been in the device market. We've always had a lot of passive and active devices. It's something that some of our customers don't know about because we're known so much for XLR, PowerCon, Speak-On, etc. But both connectors and complete devices are certainly within Neutrik's DNA. So today we're going to be talking about what we call the main actors, which are a couple different Dante devices, NA2-IO-D line and -D Pro, and some supporting actors, which are how we mount these devices, and a rugged power over Ethernet supply that we'll talk about as we come up. By the way, these part numbers make sense. NA2 Neutrik adapter 2-channel, -IO input output, -D for Dante line level, and NA2-IO-D Pro. Pro professional, because there are so many more features in the D Pro box. We'll take a good look at both of these boxes as we go forward. So I want to begin by talking about 4 really unique selling points for these Dante products. There are a lot of different Dante devices on the market, a lot of great devices. We developed some products because we thought that there were some things that we wanted to see which the industry was not making. So let's talk about what these 4 USPs are, which may be helpful to you. The first is rugged connectors. So we've got not only locking XLRs as you would expect, but also locking EtherCon connector for that network cabling. And for our power over Ethernet supply, we have a locking PowerCon True 1 TOP connection as well. So locking connectors, very valuable when you're in a situation where accidental disconnection is a possibility. The next is that we've got this unique form factor. It's very rugged. It's got this removable rubber cover. These are some images from a promotional video that we did, and you can see that, the box is not designed to be thrown around willy-nilly, but it can certainly be dropped. It can be manhandled, and it's going to survive well because of that removable rubber cover. Very helpful status lights as well. You can generally really see what's going on with this box just by looking at the LEDs, which we think is helpful when you're diagnosing an issue or you're setting up a product remotely and maybe you don't have your computer with Dante controller directly available. and multiple mounting and deployment options. So we've talked about that removable rubber cover, but you can take that off and you can mount this to a table, a podium, a floor pocket. You can also rack mount the device, and you can also put it on a truss with a special truss mount kit. So this fact that you can use the devices in multiple ways, we think is going to be very helpful for you. Well, I think we probably cannot talk about Dante solutions without talking about, well, what is Dante? So this is not a Dante webinar per se, but we can take a look at some basics of Dante. So Dante stands for Digital Audio Network through Ethernet, Dante. We can say it really has become the de facto standard in the industry just because it's been so widely adopted. Dante was developed by and is sold and maintained by a company called Audinate, which is out of Australia. Audinate very closely controls Dante. The chipsets in all Dante devices are solely manufactured and provided by Audinate. So no matter whose Dante device you buy, the Dante guts of it are going to be the same. And Audinate makes its money by selling these chips and solutions to providers like Neutrik. There are a lot of different products in the Audinate portfolio. You can see here that our NA2-IO-D line product uses the Dante Ultimo chip. The D Pro product steps up and uses the Dante Broadway chip. It has some more features, which we'll talk about. So a lot of different solutions available from Audinate. And when you look at different devices from different manufacturers, we are all pretty much constrained by what is available from Audinate, since this is such a tightly controlled technology. So how do you use Dante? Well, you add units to your network, and then you route them using what's called Dante controller software, which is free software available from Audinate. Audinate offers some great training for Dante. These are just a couple screenshots from their webpage. Certainly take advantage of what they have to offer as you're learning about and getting deeper and deeper into Dante, including getting potentially even certified for Dante. So the basics of a Dante system on a network are this. You have one or more Dante devices connected to a switch, and then you connect that switch to your computer in order to run that Dante controller software in order to configure your system. One great thing about this is it is very, very expandable. So you can just keep adding devices as you go. Here's an example. We've just added a second device. You can continue this way. You can add lots of devices. You can add lots of switches. Now you're really running a computer network that is using these Dante devices to speak with one another, with that computer determining the routing and getting everything set up and talking to all the devices talking to one another as they need to do. When you are done routing your devices, then you can remove the computer from the system, because all of those routings are stored in the firmware of all the different devices. So the computer is used for that setup, then you can take the computer away, and now you've got a static setup which will continue to work even in the absence of a computer. And even as you dismantle and reassemble the system, the devices will remember who they're talking to and what the routings are. Of course, in addition to just the standard switch, we can use EtherCon. So here's an example of a rugged switch designed for the entertainment industry, an EtherCon cable, which connects to that switch. So when you use a rugged switch like this, you've got the option of either using rugged EtherCon or using standard RJ45 connectors. So digital audio networks are great. They've got some pros and they've got some cons. And let's just talk a little bit about what those pros and cons are. Compared to a traditional analog network, a digital network like Dante is certainly much more easily configurable. It can run over inexpensive network switches. I mean, these switches are astronomically inexpensive. It's amazing to see how much you get for your money in the networking world. And they can run over inexpensive category cabling. So, you know, a category cable is cheap. It's very, very lightweight. When you compare it to, for example, an analog snake, as we're showing in that photo on the right-hand side, it's tremendously more lightweight, it's tremendously more configurable. You're no longer really stuck with a one-to-one routing as you need to have with an analog snake. Probably you already have existing computer networks. It's easy to add these to those computer networks, and you can easily molt signals, send signals over different sort of distances, which would be impossible using an analog snake. But there are some cons. One con is once you move into the digital world, you will have some latency. This doesn't matter whether it's a a digital networking solution like Dante, or if it's a digital console, once you digitize the signal, you will have some latency, and that's something which an all analog system would avoid. These solutions do require some IT knowledge to set up. It's not a great deal of IT knowledge, but a little bit. People who are familiar with computers, have used computers, should have no problem with this. But they're not as straightforward because they are IT devices. They're therefore not as easy to troubleshoot. You may at some point wind up looking like this woman on the bottom right corner. I certainly have looked like this person, thinking, what's going on? And you get these things solved, you get them resolved, but it is not as straightforward as using an all analog system. Okay, now let's move on. Let's talk specifically about Neutrik's Dante solutions. And we'll begin with this NA2-IO-D line level 2-channel input-output Dante interface. So we call this a ramp on and ramp off device for Dante networks. The idea being that you got analog gear that you want to inject into your Dante system, or you want to come out of your Dante system and hit some analog gear, potentially speakers or another mixing console or something like that. This is what the purpose for this. It is line level, so we're expecting to take an input from a mixer or a preamp or some other device that has done any necessary preamplification. 2-channel in, 2-channel out simultaneously. You can use 1 in, 1 out, whatever you want, but you can simultaneously use up to those 2 in and 2 out channels. The lockable chassis connectors, as we've talked about, powered over PoE, which is power over Ethernet, which means that you need to use a standard supply to provide that power. We'll be talking quite a bit about what PoE means and how PoE gets implemented as we go further in the discussion. That rugged housing with that rubber protection, which we've talked about, compatible, of course, with Neutrik's mounting options. And this uses Audinate's Ultimo chip, as we saw in a few slides earlier. A couple things to know about this chip are that its latency is constrained to 1 millisecond at the fastest. The Ultimo chip is a low-cost design that's really made for these basic 2 in, 2 out devices. It has that minimum latency, and another important feature about the Ultimo chip is you cannot route inputs to outputs on the same device. So if you wanted to inject a signal in the network, but also take that signal out in order to use it right there locally, that is something that you cannot do with the Ultimo chip. So that's a constraint for this NA2-IO-D line and for any other device from any other manufacturer which uses the same chip. I talked about how much I love these status LEDs, and it's really fantastic. So we've got network status LEDs and system LEDs, and these give you all sorts of good information about the system starting up, the system being ready, the system searching for sync, the slave mode, master mode, etc. This is all available by looking at these LEDs, which again, for a remote diagnostic and remote setup situation is extremely helpful. Okay, so that's it for the D-line product, which is the straight ahead 2 in, 2 out line level interface. Now let's move on and take a look at the NA2-IO-D Pro, which is much, much more feature laden, significantly more expensive as a result. But we've got quite a bit of exciting stuff to talk about here with the D Pro device. So again, we consider it a ramp on, ramp off device for these Dante networks. Unlike the D-line, it's got multiple analog formats and digital signal formats. Again, it's a 2 in, 2 out device, lockable chassis connectors, and it's got this great feature of the switchable XLR, which auto detects and auto switches between analog operation or AES EBU operation. And this is true on both the input and the output side. So for example, you can have analog in, analog out, AES EBU in, analog out, AES EBU in, AES EBU out. All the different combinations are available. Again, it's PoE powered. You'll see that there's no DC power connector, for example, on these devices, so it does need to receive that power through the Ethernet cable. Unlike the NA2-IO-D line, this one has primary and secondary Dante ports, which can be very valuable in your configuration. We'll take a good, strong look at that. Again, the rubber protection, compatible with Neutrik's mounting options, and this one uses Audinate's Broadway chip, which has a much lower minimum latency of 0.25 milliseconds. So this Broadway chip, along with that minimum latency, does allow you to route inputs to outputs on the same device. And that enhanced feature set allows the use of 2 Ethernet ports. So the Ultimo chip only allows 1 port. This allows 2 ports. And we put both those ports on this device. And again, as we go further in the presentation, we'll see how those ports can be used. So let's talk about the analog and the digital audio options. The inputs can be line level analog, exactly the same as the D-line product. They can be microphone level analog, and that level has variable gain, switchable pad, and switchable phantom power per channel. Or those inputs can be AES EBU, 2-channel audio. Now, it's going to be one or the other. So you cannot have, for example, a microphone in channel 1 and an AES EBU in channel 2 in order to get 3 channels. That's not the case. It's going to be a maximum of 2 channels in, 2 channels out. So if you use AES EBU, then you'll use the one connector to get those 2 channels. The outputs, again, analog outputs available, and this time with variable attenuation and an AES EBU 2-channel digital audio output option. There are lots of different status lights. There's lots of switching available, lots going on here. So let's take a look at some of the really cool features here. The first being this auto switching of analog and AES EBU inputs and outputs. So if I plug into channel 1, and you'll see the legending, it says channel 1 ANA, then it's going to be an analog device for that input or for that output. So you can see here by plugging into channel 1, I'm in analog world. Once I've plugged into channel 1, I can plug into channel 2 as well. And again, I'm remaining in analog world. And you can see that legending for channel 2. It says channel 2, analog or AES, right? So what's driving this is channel 1. Now, if I only plug into channel 2, the device will auto reconfigure as an AES EBU device. That's nice. So you don't need to make specific changes in software. You don't need to carry additional functions or features or equipment around to make that happen. Simply plug into channel 2 and not into channel 1, and you're in AES EBU mode. Now you can mix and match this. So in this example, I'm running analog inputs, right? Because I've got something plugged into channel 1, and an AES EBU output because, again, on the outputs, I only have channel 2 connected. And I guess this is the last combination. Analog outputs, but an AES EBU input, again, because of how I'm using or not using that channel 1 connection. This connection configuration is made according to whether you plug that cable connector in or not. It is a physical switch on the unit, which drives the firmware in the unit in order to configure for either analog or AES EBU. Lots of great LEDs here. So on the input side, signal present. And this is a tricolor LED. It will line up green, yellow, or red, depending upon the signal level. An LED for phantom power. An LED for whether you have a high-pass filter or a pad on there. Again, various different ways that we use the multicolor LED there. For the outputs, we have a mute LED, and then all these various other system LEDs. If the system is starting, if it's ready, the input type, which is going to be analog or AES EBU. The output type also analog or AES EBU. So again, from the device itself, you get a lot of great information about what's happening with your connections, as well as what's happening with your network status. The rear has a reset button, that's helpful. Has the same link and active LEDs for each Ethernet port that the D-line has, and then has a primary and secondary Ethercon chassis connector. And we'll talk about the use of the primary and secondary ports. So how do we control all of this? Well, it's a lot of features here. We control it by using a software controller, dPro controller, which is a PC or Mac application, free application available. And with this, the software will find the device on the network and allow you to provide configuration. Now, if you're using a QSys system from QSC, a plugin is available for you to control this from the QSys environment. More direct control from devices is coming. It is an AES 70 compliant device. AES 70 is a control protocol, so because of that compliance, lots of different devices can interrogate and control the dPro directly without the need for the software control. But at the moment, we'll talk about the software control. It's the easiest way for us to talk about how this works, and it's how you will probably configure the device, most likely. So the first thing you do is you select a device to edit, and you can see on the left side of the screen, we're showing multiple different devices. And so you select one particular device if you do have multiple ones on the network. And then you can work with the input. So you can see here that we've got a mic line toggle. We've got a link toggle here as well. If you select mic, you've got variable gain, you've got selectable phantom power, and you see that this is not shown for channel 2, which in this case is shown as the as a line level input. And you've got that 80 hertz high pass filter. And by the way, you can see here on the right side that by only plugging into channel 2, not plugging into channel 1, all of that configuration information disappears from channel 1. And what you see instead is that stereo or 2-channel AES EBU signal being monitored. So lots of different flexibility and power here for the input channels. The output channels, similar situation where you can see on the right side an AES EBU configuration with channel 1 grayed out. On the left side, you can see the 2 different channels with variable output, mute, linkability as well here. The D-Pro controller has a meter bar for these signal levels. These green, yellow, red indicators are the same thing that you will see on the status light, the tricolor status light for each channel on the front of the unit as well. So that's a nice coordination between the software and the hardware. You can save presets. This is very cool. So you can create a new preset, name it, and then if you want to use the device in one way or another, or if you know that, well, I'm using it in a certain case with these condenser microphones, which require so much gain, and another case with these dynamic microphones, which require other gain, or AES EBU, whatever, you can create all sorts of different presets, which you can easily call up for those particular uses. So here's an example of selecting a device and loading a preset. You can reset the device, of course, from within the D-Pro controller software. There's also a reset button on the rear of the device itself. A menu that shows you information about the device, including the firmware. Network settings window, which lets you review your network settings, enter a static IP address, change your IP addresses, etc. This is not normally necessary, but for those people who are, let's say, a little bit more proficient with networks, a little bit more advanced in their Dante knowledge, it's nice that you can create this static IP addressing if you want. Otherwise, the device will use DHCP, Dynamic Host Control Protocol, as a default. And here's just an example of that QSys plugin for the QSC software, which we talked about as well. So this is how the device looks under QSys control. So let's compare the specifications of these couple of devices. Let's begin with the D-Pro device. So you see the supported sampling rates up to 96 kilohertz, latency minimum of 0.25 milliseconds. Power consumption, we can say 6 watts, right? Less than 6 watts, but up to that level. 22 dBu input level, 22 dBu output level. That's important information to consider. Signal noise ratio of greater than 100 dB. The D-line, by comparison, again up to 96 kilohertz. The latency no less than 1 millisecond. Again, that's based upon that Ultimo chip that we're using. Input level 22 dBu, output level 16 dBu. So a difference here, and that difference is intentional because of how we believe that these different devices will be used. And you'll see the signal to noise ratio also good there, above 100 dB. So the next slide here is sort of torture for you. This shows us back to back, but I know this is so small it's not really readable, but this is a summary of what we've just talked about. And again, we talked about these Ultimo and Broadway chips. This is an example of those two differences. The Broadway chip will go up to 192K, even though we have constrained our device to 96K. Different latency, different network speeds as well. So the Ultimo chip runs up to 100 megabits. The Broadway chip runs up to 1 gigabit speed. Okay, let's talk about power over Ethernet, because as we have discussed, these devices do not have a separate DC power input. They need to be powered, and they will be powered over that same network cable that is carrying data as well. So the concept of PoE should be very familiar. If you've got a telephone on your desk, you're using a precursor to PoE, which is that you're providing power to that telephone using the same cable, which is also providing communication back and forth. Ethernet power works the same. And there are two ways to get this power over Ethernet. One is to have a switch which has PoE, power over Ethernet, built into the switch. And if you can see the legending on this slide, you can see that it says 5-port gigabit desktop switch with 4-port PoE. So this is very common. Here's a switch where some but not all of the ports have PoE. So one way to get PoE is with a switch. Another is with what's called a PoE injector. So a device like this plugs into wall power. You plug a cable in from your switch or wherever else it does not have PoE. Then you plug a cable out. And what the PoE injector is doing is it is combining that data with power from the wall in order to provide power over Ethernet. I show these two different RJ45s to make the point that the one on the top is shielded, the one on the bottom is unshielded. It does not matter for the sake of PoE. PoE will run equally well over shielded and unshielded cables. So let's look at some definitions. We talked about what PoE means, power over Ethernet. We'll be talking about a PD, which is a powered device. Well, that's a device, like the D-Line or the D-Pro devices we have. And we'll be talking about the PSE, the power sourcing equipment. This is a switch with PoE, or it's a PoE injector. So these terms will keep coming up as we keep talking here. So here is an example of two different ways that power can be provided, in this case to the D-Pro device. On the left side, you see a PoE switch. So that PoE switch is what's providing that power to the D-Pro device. On the right-hand side, you see a switch with no PoE support. And so what that's doing is that's connecting over a cable to a PoE injector. And that PoE injector is then connecting to the D-Pro device. So again, it's more straightforward and simple to use a PoE switch, less cabling. Using a PoE injector adds a little bit of complexity, but as we will see later in the conversation, using the right PoE injector can have some significant benefits to it. Now, it's very important for our devices. Our devices require a PoE switch or injector, which is IEEE 802.3 compliant, and compliant to Class 2 or compliant to no classification. So here's an example of a PoE switch on the left side, and here's an example of a couple different PoE injectors on the right side. The one on the bottom is your just sort of basic plastic PoE injector that is sort of a commodity item. The one above that is Neutrik's NPS-30W, which you can immediately see is a much beefier device, and we'll talk again quite a bit about the NPS-30W device. There are devices that are called with class and with no class, and this is an important distinction. So PoE devices that have a class designation, which are also called active PSE, have a discovery process which they go through with the device which they're powering. And that discovery process works like this. A physical connection is made, a short voltage impulse is created, the PSE returns that value, the power sourcing equipment reads that return value and provides power accordingly based upon that little handshake protocol that's just happened. By contrast, a no-class PoE device, also called a passive PSE, acts just like a classic power supply. There's no discovery. Current is being supplied at all times. It's much more typical of, for example, that little wall wart that I'm showing on the bottom right corner there. So again, active PSE has that handshaking protocol. No class PoE or passive PSE acts as a classic power supply. So again, here's that PoE with class. Again, the short voltage impulse is made. A handshake process determines how the power is going to be provided. No class PoE, no discovery process, no negotiation between devices. The PSE is always sending current. Now, let's talk about these PoE classes. Unfortunately, there's so many different classes and standards here. But Ethernet generally is defined by IEEE 802.3. 802.3 AF defines PoE classes 0 through 3, and you can see the power availability there. 802.3 AT uses the same classes, but introduces class 4, which has higher power. And 802.3 BT introduces even higher power on top of that. So the term class here refers to the maximum available power output. Regardless of the class, the maximum voltage is always 57 volts. Now, Neutrik Dante devices can handle all classes, but we require IEEE 802.3 compliance. And the D-Pro, which operates at up to 6 watts, requires class 2 or above. So you can see here that the class 1 only goes to 3.84 watts of power. that's sufficient for the NA2-IO-D line. The D Pro's pulling more power because of those microphone preamps and other features as well. So that requires a class 2 or higher device, or a device with no class. Be cautious. Not all PoE injectors are IEEE 802.3 compliant. Non-compliant injectors may work with the specific equipment for which they're intended, but they may not operate at sufficient voltage. And there are different examples of this, but if you have a device from us or from any other manufacturer and you plug it into a PoE injector and it doesn't light up, it doesn't turn on, it is likely that that is not an 802.3 compliant PoE injector. And the manufacturers do not always do a good job of telling you whether it is or not, but insist on it. Insist on knowing what is the 802.3 compliance and what is the class. It should cost you no more money if you're buying one of these little plastic devices, but it will give you peace of mind and let you know that you're buying a device which is truly going to be operational for these sorts of devices. Okay, let's move on and talk about Dante's 2 operational modes. These modes are defined by Audinate. They're set in Dante controller. One is called redundant mode, and this makes sense. You've got 2 switches. One is for a primary network and one is for a redundant network, really for failover purposes, right? So, okay, you want to be sure that if one network goes down, you still have audio. That's the purpose of redundant mode. The second mode is called switched mode, and I really wish that they would call it daisy chain mode or something. But the idea here is that you're using one switch, but one device is chaining directly into another, into another, into another. So you've got these 2 ports on the back of a device, and you can imagine that you can use them either to connect to 2 different switches, or you can use one port to connect to a switch and another port to connect to another device. The difference between those two is redundant mode and switched mode. And again, this is Audinate's terminology here. Now, redundant mode and switch mode are relevant to NA2-IO-D Pro because it's got 2 Ethernet ports. This is not relevant to the D-line device, which only has 1 Ethernet port. So all of this discussion that we're about to have about redundant mode and switch mode, keep in mind, relevant to NA2-IO-D Pro and any other Dante device you may have, which has 2 Ethernet ports, but it cannot be relevant to a device with only 1 port. It's not possible. So here's an example of redundant mode. I know that this is kind of hard to follow, but we can see that if you begin at the D Pro, you can see that there's a primary connection, and we're showing this primary connection to a PoE injector, and then to a switch. And then there's a secondary connection, which is to another PoE injector, and then to a second switch. So you can see in this redundant approach, if you follow these green lines, you've got 2 switches in the system. And again, that's the primary switch and the redundant or failover switch. In switched mode, which I always think of daisy chain as daisy chain mode, you connect one device into another. So if you begin on the bottom, you'll see a D Pro, which connects into another D Pro higher up, and then higher up that connects into another D Pro. So that's a perfect example of switched mode, where one device is feeding another, and then, of course, one of those devices finally hits a switch in order to connect to that Dante network. So let's talk about the powered device in redundant mode. Let's say that you've got 2 switches which both have PoE. Well, a PoE switch is an active device. In other words, it's going to have a handshaking process. So if the primary switch goes down, the secondary switch will be active and there will be a handshaking process. And that handshaking process may result in some audio glitching, right? Because that handshaking process takes some time. So we at Neutrik say, well, that's not a real redundant network because of that possibility of that glitching. That's unacceptable. So for real power and data redundancy, we recommend using a switch without PoE and using these NPS-30W, this makes sense, Neutrik Power Supply -30 watt PoE supplies, because these are passive equipment. They do not use handshaking. They're always on. And so you can imagine that if your primary network fails and you move on to your secondary network, well, that NPS-30W is always providing power. There is no handshaking, and you can get a glitch-free solution. So let's talk more about this NPS-30W now that we have spoken so much about PoE and how PoE works and how it works in redundant mode and switched mode in a Dante network. So again, Neutrik Power Supply 30 watt. It is the world's first PoE injector that is made for harsh stage conditions. It's got a 30-watt power budget, and consider that you've got up to 6 watts on the NA2-IO-D Pro. 1 gigabit speed, which is good. It matches that Broadway chip speed of 1 gig. True 48-volt DC output. A passive PoE injector, again, acts as a classic power supply with current always available. Lockable power and network connections. Okay, that's great for stage use. You don't need to worry about something being discontinued. Companion for any PoE application. It does not simply need to be used with the Neutrik Dante boxes. It's got the same form factor, but it can be used with any other device which requires PoE, especially a device which needs to perform under rugged live conditions. Perfect for use with Neutrik networking devices. A great example of this is because one of these devices providing 30 watts can power up to 4 D-Pros. Well, you can use 4 of them for ambient miking applications, right? You can set 8 of them up around your facility. They can all be powered over this one device. They can be used in switched modes, so they're all daisy chained together. And then that signal can be sent from the last of those devices into the switch, into the Dante network. The front and rear, well, front's pretty easy. Data plus power output. The rear is pretty simple too. It's a data input without PoE, and then the power injection through the PowerCon True 1 TOP connection. And notice the power indicator lights on both the front and rear sides. That's great because your number one issue with a PoE injector is going to be, is this thing on? Well, you can see from both the front and the rear that yes, it is on, or if the LED is not on, obviously not. So why is Neutrik offering this rugged injector? Well, the basic reason for this is that PoE was originally intended for fixed installations, for non-harsh usages. If you look at these PoE injectors on the market, none of these are built for stage use. None of them are rugged. By contrast, certainly our device is rugged. So again, let's take a look at this slide, which kind of shows the same information we've seen before. Consider this NA2-IO-D Pro, which is running in redundant mode with a primary and secondary switch. The NPS-30W is a passive PSE device, so it's always supplying current. So there will be no glitching due to handshaking if there's a failover from one network to the other. And in switched mode, again, here we can see a nice example of these 4, or in this example, I guess, 3 different products. It could be up to 4 D-Pros. It could be even more if we use the D-line of these products connecting to one another, and then connecting to that power injector NPS-30W, and from there getting to the switch. So some information about PoE. Never use an Ethernet crossover cable. For loads of 20 watts or higher, it is mandatory that you use AWG 24 or higher. For cable lengths of 50 meters or longer, also mandatory use AWG 24 or higher wire. And foil shielded UTP Cat6a cables are recommended. So these are not specific requirements for our devices. These are general important guidelines to be aware of. Always use a Cat5e cable or higher to be on the safe side. At this point, there's really no reason to use anything less than that. But again, the foil UTP Cat6a cables are a fantastic solution. Now, pin assignment can vary from supplier to supplier. That's tricky, but know that the Neutrik network devices accept every pin assignment. And the Neutrik network devices are protected and will shut down if there is some miswiring or some sort of problem. NPS-30W is packaged in a couple different ways. It's packaged just on its own, and it's also packaged with a PowerCon True 1 TOP cable. So we offer for the NEMA type cables used in the US, and Schuko and some different types of cables used around the world. In the US, we stock and we sell the device without a cable assembly and one that includes a cable assembly as well. Here's some specifications for NPS-30W. Probably not so important to review, but always available for you. So a summary: heavy duty for rugged stage conditions, will work with any other network device that requires PoE and that's pulling less than 30 watts. Lockable power connectors, lockable network connectors, passive PSE, no handshaking, compatible with all existing Neutrik mounting accessories, perfect for use with the NA2-IO-D Pro with its redundant and switched modes. All right, let's move on and let's talk about the mounting accessories that we have for these boxes. Again, they are so configurable. They can be placed in so many different places. We've got some really neat accessories for them. So we've got a mounting bracket, so you can put these on a table or podium, floor box, etc. Truss mount kit to mount 1 or 2 devices on a truss. A rear panel, rack panel, in which you can mount 1 or 2 devices, front or backwards, with 4D size holes as well. We'll take a look at each of these. So the mounting bracket kit is simple to use. You take off the rubber, you put in this hardware, and then you can rotate this from -90 to +90 degrees. Very easy to use. Great for putting in, for example, a podium, lectern, etc., where you want easy access to a Dante network. You can see here how this works. So obviously, pull out the rubber cover in step 1, insert a washer in step 2, and a screw, and you're good to go. So very, very easy assembly here. The truss mount kit allows you to install up to 2 devices on a truss. It comes with 2 safety frames, all the screws that you need in order to make this truss mount work. And again, here are just some assembly instructions for that truss mount kit. Very, very clear how this all works. And this NRP1RU-2A allows you to mount 1 or 2 devices in a rack. You can see from the photo down below that in this example, one is mounted facing forward, the other is mounted facing backward. And you've got 4D size holes, which are great for feed-through adapters, for example, if you need to make a configuration which may require some pass-through cabling. By the way, I want to point out, if you've seen these little blank cover plates, this is DBA-BL. Just a nice little Neutrik accessory to be aware of. If you have ugly, empty holes in your panels and you want to cover them up, that's exactly what this DBA-BL part is for. And you can replace the rubber cover. So the device ships with a rubber cover. If you lose it or damage it or something, you can replace it. So what are these applications? What are these devices made for? Well, they're certainly made for stage use. Unlike a lot of other devices, unlike almost all PoE injectors, they are rugged, they are heavy duty, they are rubber protected, they can be thrown around without much worry, they can be truss mounted, they can be rack mounted. They're great for ambient miking as well. They're small. The D Pro especially has got so many different features with its microphone preamps that you can use it for ambient miking throughout your facility. Of course, they're great for installations, permanent installations, podiums, lecterns, meeting rooms, etc. House of Worship sort of combines all of this together. So everything that we've talked about is applicable for House of Worship. It's great for outdoor broadcasting trucks, for feeding those trucks with AES EBU signals, talking from truck to truck, providing temporary throwdown types of solutions for additional audio channels for Dante Network. And of course, corporate and educational AV, which is really sort of a subset of staging, I would say. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about today. Thank you very much for your attention. It's wonderful to speak with you. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. We're very happy to talk with you and help you configure your system and help you understand how our devices can fit into your overall Dante network. Thank you very much, and stay safe and be well. Bye-bye.